All right, here's what we'll make do with here. Okay, is everybody seeing the slides now? Excellent. Okay, so here we are. Finally got it figured out. So as I mentioned, City of Lakewood Historic Preservation Commission consists of some commissioners you see here, and today we have Rebecca as our representative. And then the commissioners work with City of Lakewood staff, Matthew Schubert and Shannon Terrell. Here's some bios about Rebecca and I. I'm a structural engineer, and I work on existing buildings, especially historic ones. I was on the City of Lakewood Historic Preservation Commission for 2 terms. Rebecca is an architect specializing in historic preservation, and she's on her 5th year serving on the commission. So I'm going to start us off by talking about what makes a building or site eligible for historic designation. What is the role of the Historic Preservation Commission? And then we're going to go into the City of Lakewood historic styles, architectural styles. We're going to talk some case studies, and then we'll discuss benefits of designation. So a little bit of context here with this slide. When we're talking about a building that is over 50 years old, we might ask ourselves, is this building historic with a capital H, or is it just old? So there's a definition. When we say something is historic with a capital H, we mean that it's been designated as historic by a government entity. In 1967, the Historic Preservation Act was passed with the goal of documenting and retaining retaining culturally significant sites and structures. State and local governments have passed similar ordinances with the same goals, just enacted at a local level. In the City of Lakewood, a site or building could be designated as a landmark through the federal government, which is run by the National Park Service, the State Historic Preservation Office, you'll hear people call that SHPO, or locally the City of Lakewood. It could be designated one or all of these, through all of these avenues. The City of Lakewood Historic Preservation Ordinance was pretty recently adopted in 2014. The City of Lakewood is a certified local government, which means that the Historic Preservation Plan and the Commission are recognized by the State Historic Preservation Office and the National Park Service. And what this means is that the different entities can work together, have similar goals. This makes the endeavors by the local Historic Preservation Commission recognized at state and the national levels and eligible for grants, etc. The City of Lakewood Historic Preservation Plan is relatively new. 2012, it was published in 2012. And you can see there are many of our historic structures are listed under the National Register because that was what was available at the time. Now things can be registered locally, of course, at the state and nationally. Historic preservation is the protection, rehabilitation, restoration, or reconstruction of districts or sites, buildings, structures, objects, etc., that have an influence in history, architecture, archaeology, geography, engineering, and in our culture. And that's a quote, which is why it was so hard for me to say. I'm not sure whether this map has all of the, is comprehensive, but it's a nice overview of the types of sites we have designated within the city. So the Historic Preservation Commission was created to guide the execution of the City of Lakewood's Historic Preservation Plan, which, if you're into such things, you can dig up the ordinance and find Article 11. It has all the rules and regulations that the City Preservation Plan and the Historic Preservation Commission operate under. The commission's role, the commissioner's role, are to review applications against the designation criteria. They review proposed alterations to designated properties. So that could be things like replacement of deteriorated elements, often that's siding or windows. They conduct or authorize, so sometimes they retain a consultant to do the work, inventory of sites and structures or areas that are appropriate for designation. And I'll show you some examples of that. And they advise the public regarding work on designated structures or districts. So one of the roles of the commission has been to commissions survey plans to document historic areas. And here are some of the areas that have already been surveyed to document the history of the area and the structures. A comprehensive list of the Historic Preservation Commission's duties and the preservation ordinance can be found on the City of Lakewood's website. Along with, you can get detailed information of all the different landmarks and districts, properties that are listed, and past studies. So let's talk about what makes a building designatable, if you will. There again, it's that capital H old or just capital H historic. Per the City of Lakewood criteria, and which is very similar to the national and local and state criteria, the site or building has to be associated with events that have a significant contribution to the history of the area, or broad patterns of the city's history. Or the site or building can be associated with the lives of persons influential to the city's history. Another criteria can be that the building or site embodies the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or could be an example of the work of a master. If we had a famous architect, for instance, in the city, that would be designatable under that criteria. It could also be a site that's important to history or prehistory. Maybe it has or is likely to yield new information, or it is culturally significant to the city. Historic designation also requires what we call integrity, which is the ability of a property to convey its historical associations or attributes. So examples would be location, setting, design, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. Okay, so now that you have some background on the City of Lakewood's Historic Preservation Plan, what the commission does, and what historic designation with a capital H means, let's get into something a little bit more interesting, and Rebecca will share with us some of the historic architectural styles in the City of Lakewood.
Thanks, Nicole, and welcome everybody.
Sure.
Thanks for being here. We are excited to give this presentation and welcome any comments, questions after the presentation. But to jump right in, I'm going to go over some of the architectural styles and roughly following the development patterns of Lakewood, which I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with. But the first settlements in Lakewood were agricultural in nature, and these structures often were simple formed buildings with little to no ornamentation. They began rectilinear in plan and then often had multiple additions over time as families grew and changed. They were often made with easily accessible materials such as stone and wood. And often they encompassed a lot more than just a house. Since these were agricultural, a lot of times they had barns or boarding houses or other farm buildings that surrounded the house. And that really speaks to the context. Whereas, a lone building by itself, like the stone house, obviously worth preserving and designating. But if it still had sort of that agricultural context, that's definitely something that we look for in as far as the integrity that Nicole had mentioned. So then there was the sanatoriums that were common in Lakewood. Most notable, the JCRS institution, which is now REMCAD, and Craig Hospital, which has been demolished, was another one. These often were neoclassical styles, And they were intended to portray permanence and prosperity. They're simple forms, often rectilinear in plan, but dramatic and a much greater scale than the rest of the sort of residential buildings in Lakewood. Common with neoclassical, you'll see some of the classical elements brought back, such as the columns or pediments, and symmetry and repetition were very common as well. Then we get to the Denver retreat. So there were a lot of residents from the city of Denver that wanted to escape the hustle and bustle and probably air pollution of the city and escape out to the country. One of these, Molly Brown Summer House, which is still present, Belmar Mansion, which unfortunately is not, as we all know. And so again, these were Denverites who sought peace and quiet outside of the city. They were often larger, more elaborate, high-style architecture. The Molly Brown Summer House, which was built in 1897, is a brick four-square. So it has a sandstone base, large bay window that you can see in that photo, eyebrow windows, some roof finials, and it has a square plan, often 2 stories tall, more of a boxy design with a hipped roof, and then some arts and crafts detailing involved as well. The Belmar Mansion, on the other hand, built in 1936, is a Beaux-Arts style. And this is also symmetrical, but is opulent and has a lot of elaborate ornamentation and sculptural pieces. It was influenced by Baroque and Rococo styles. And it is also symmetrical, but usually with a flat roof. And then the Broadmoor Country Club and the Aviation Country Club, and then I think Lakewood was on there too, were in the early 1900s. Lakewood Country Club, built in 1905, unfortunately burned down twice. So we don't have that anymore. And then the Broadmoor Country Club or Aviation Country Club in 1925 really served as a hub for these wealthy Denver retreat houses. So some of our education brought other styles of architecture to Lakewood. One is the Washington Heights School, and that was built in 1898. And it's more a vernacular style, but it also has elements of colonial revival, one of which being the entryway with the arched transom window and the pediment above. And it does have some engaged columns too that lend that sort of classical elements to it. On the right-hand side, we have the North Lakewood Elementary School from 1947, and this was the Art Moderne style. And this was a subset of Art Deco, which is kind of a broad umbrella for several styles. But this encompassed horizontal lines, often rounded corners, like you can see on the entryway there, and sort of a more aerodynamic aesthetic. So then we get to the Colfax car culture and how that brought a lot of development through the city. One example is Davies Chuck Wagon from 1957. This is Streamline Moderne, which is also a subset of Art Deco, but much more sort of that aerodynamic and sleek horizontality. Another example of this would be the White Way Grill, which is at Belmar Park. And then there's also the Colfax motels. There's definitely a lot of them that are still extant, but a lot of them have been lost already. A lot of these were of the Streamline Moderne style or mid-century modern. The mid-century modern was characterized by low sloping roofs, or flat roofs, a really thin roof profile, and deep roof overhangs with floor to ceiling windows. So the A&D motel that you can see there, that's a type of mid-century modern style. The mid-century modern also had prairie style and Bauhaus influences. The other thing about the Colfax that is particularly interesting to me is the signs. And there are definitely still some that are extant, but they're a very interesting and unique part of Colfax and of that time period that definitely is unique. So one of the styles that comes with those signs is called Googie architecture. And it's futuristic, characterized by zigzags and angles, neon signs, bright colors. Back when it first became used, it was actually a derogatory term for this type of style, but I think it's great. And so I don't mind using it to describe those things. So anyway, moving on to suburbanization. And so this was brought about by the streetcar, the Denver and Intermountain Railroad, and the Denver Ordnance Plant, which is now the Federal Center, brought jobs out west from downtown Denver and brought that development along Colfax and sort of spread from there. Also, adding to that was the post-war housing boom. So our first style here on the top left is our ranch style, and it's simple, rectangular, single-story buildings, usually a hipped or gable roof. Next to that is a minimal traditional style, which is similar to a ranch, but usually even a little bit smaller and a little bit simpler. Usually not as many overhangs or porches added onto the front. Next, in the top right-hand corner, we have our craftsman and bungalow styles, one of my personal favorites. And these were common in the 1920s. They emphasized natural materials like brick and stone and wood. They usually had deep roof overhangs. The one that you see here was likely that front area with all the windows was likely an open porch when it was originally constructed. So it really had that deep overhang. Often also included exposed beams and rafters. Then on the second row, left side, we have our colonial revival style. And this was present turn of the century through the 1940s and characterized by a two-story, usually a side gable and or a gambrel roof, which is what is seen in the second row on the right-hand side. And then lastly, we have our Cape Cod down at the bottom, which is a small rectangular plan with usually smaller windows, often again side gabled, and steep pitched roofs, often with dormers in them as well. Then we move on to our Tudor Revival and English Norman. And these were common 1910 to 1940. And they're characterized by steep pitched roofs, often with kind of the swooping steep pitched roof over the entryway, as well as the half timbering, which is sort of the exposed wood structure that you can see from Nicole's pointer, thank you, in that gable. Likely these were not structural, although they were the original English Tudors from Europe. That would have been the exposed structure that they infilled around it. The ones that were built here in the early 1900s, that was likely decorative. But these often also had an asymmetrical plan. And the difference between English Norman, it's very similar to Tudor. It's just usually a little bit more restrained, a little less less ornamentation, usually not the half timbering. Next to that, we have our Mediterranean revival, and that's characterized by low sloped roofs, clay tile, as you can see in that photo, often stucco walls, and these often also had an asymmetrical plan. And then we have our Victorian, which is that picture there is actually the Lassie House, which is one of our designated properties. And this was common from the 1850s to 1900s. One of the key characteristics for this is the Palladian style windows that you can see on the second floor. And basically that's an arch-topped window in the middle flanked by two rectangular windows. And sometimes that arch top can be an ornamentation, as in this case, or sometimes it's actually a full window and the arch top is a part of the window itself. And then also, it's a little bit difficult to see in this picture, but if you zoom in really close, you can see the Queen Anne style window mullions on the windows. And that's a dead giveaway for Victorian. Next, we have our Gothic revival, and this picture is actually the Loveland House. Unfortunately not designated, although we would love to have it be. And it's categorized by steeply pitched roofs and tall, skinny windows. Often they're pointed arches and masonry or stucco walls. Then below that, we have our French eclectic, which was common 1920s to 1940s. It often had hipped roofs, masonry or stucco walls, so definitely a more permanent sentiment. And then also sometimes there's rounded towers, which is also sort of a key characteristic of the French eclectic. And lastly, we have our mid-century modern, and I talked a little bit about that with the Colfax development, but in this picture, you can see the really thin roof profile and the floor-to-ceiling windows, and it was really sort of the beginning of the open plan living. All right, now we will move on to a few of our designated properties and give you a little bit more in-depth information on those. Our first one, which was actually our first designated property, was the O'Kane Farm, and it was built in 1901. It's a traditional frame farmhouse with some elements of Victorian and a little bit of craftsman as well. One thing to note in the photo, the ornamentation at the top of the gables is not original. That was added later in the 70s. But you can see the Victorian steeply pitched roof on the entry gable, and then the shingle siding as well lends to a little bit of craftsman style. And you can go to the next slide.
Ready?
Yep, thank you. So as I was mentioning earlier, the context of a building is important, and this one actually does have quite a bit of that historic context. This was actually designated as a historic district rather than a landmark building, which allows a little bit more flexibility in what is done with the building itself. So this includes the main house, which we looked at in the previous photo. There is a bunkhouse, a barn, a well structure, and then a fence that surrounds the property. And so this was house of Barney O'Kane Jr., which was in the Colorado State House and also the district attorney. So this was, I believe when this was designated, it accounted for several of the different criteria that Nicole mentioned earlier in the presentation. So here we can see a few of the interesting details. On the top left, we have the front entry of the house, and I don't have the exact dates of these photos off the top of my head, but I believe that was Barney O'Kane Jr.'s mother that's standing in that photo, and you can see the extended rafter tails behind her and the shingle siding. On the top right, I believe that is Barney O'Kane Jr. standing in front of the house, and you can see one of the really interesting things about this this house is the chimney, which is mostly field stone, but then there's also inset quartz pieces in there. So it's definitely sort of a higher style than you would typically see in farmhouses of this era. And you can switch to the next one. So here are some photos of the house today. Actually, this was a few years ago, I think, when the designation came through. But it does maintain a lot of its original integrity. One being the site context that we mentioned. The gable decorations were added after the period of significance, but they are somewhat removable. And so they're not too much negatively impacting that integrity. The windows have been changed, unfortunately. And then there's dog houses that have been added to the property. They came from one of the other farms nearby that has been since destroyed. So it gives another hint to life at that time, although they are not original to the house and the property. And so this is no longer surrounded by fields, obviously, but it is a park. So it does support the buildings and this sort of open space around. And then you can see in the top picture the white fence, which maintains that sort of site boundary similar to its original configuration. Also, its relationship to the street hasn't changed. So that means a lot. A lot of times, if buildings were originally set back from a street and there was this nice promenade up to the building and then something is built in front of it, it really can change that integrity because it changes how you experience the building. But in this case, we still have that. So here's a couple other photos of some of the other buildings on the site. The middle and the top is the barn. And then the bottom one is the bunkhouse, which is in pretty sad shape, but it's still there. And you can move on to the next one.
That's me.
And then I will turn it over to Nicole for the Hospice of St. John.
Great, thank you. So this is designated properties. The Preservation Commission designated this, I think, in the last few years while I was on the commission. The criterion for this designation was really the historic events and historic persons, because as you can see from these photos, there's really nothing that special about the site. It was built in the 1960s, and the historical significance was set as 1977. What makes the site important, as I mentioned, the buildings are the site's nothing special, but it was associated with the first inpatient hospice in the Denver area, and actually the second in the nation, which is very exciting. It was founded in 1977 by Father Paul von Lobowitz, who was a leader in the development of the hospice industry. Both Father Paul and the hospice were recognized at all levels of the government for their important contributions to the community. Father Paul had a philosophy for hospice that the hospice is a house of healing. We try to heal the spirits and mend the relationships that may not be whole. And so this really set, a precedent for hospice care. And there were several buildings, they were generally hospice rooms with small chapel and site for visiting family. One of the major benefits of designating this property is that it made it eligible for historic tax credits and grants. So the developer who purchased the property was able to leverage some of that to renovate it, revitalize it, and turn it into low-income housing. And so for us, this is a great example of one of the major benefits of designation is that while the buildings themselves weren't special, the site is, and we can leverage that and keep it alive by continuing to use it. Another example of a historic designation in the city of Lakewood is the Lassie House, which Rebecca mentioned because it's a very good example of the late Victorian era construction. And so that was the criterion for the designation here. Was it's very characteristic, other than the garage on the right, the rest of the building is very characteristic of the Victorian home. Defining features include this gable front, as Rebecca mentioned, I think she's called it Palladian windows. You can kind of see some of the window styling here. That's pretty exciting. And then on the side of the house, there's actually a bow window, which, here we go. We've got a bow windows, and then we've got square cut shingles, which you can barely see here. And so this was a very exciting designation. The homeowner actually was excited to designate it and protect it because they felt strongly about the home, and it does retain so much of that character and integrity. So those are our case studies. I think, Rebecca, are you going to give us some closing comments here?
Sure. So as Nicole said in our intro, as the commission, we have several responsibilities as far as reviewing nominations and reviewing proposals for alterations to designated properties. But as you saw on our list, we don't have a ton to review as of now. So this makes it pretty fun for us. We get to be a little bit more proactive with our surveying and trying to protect buildings before they are threatened. So our focus has really been on outreach and surveying different neighborhoods to try to get a better inventory of what historic properties are in Lakewood and which ones might be eligible for designation. So we're really hoping to be more proactive rather than reactive in preserving our heritage. And we really rely on the community and people like you who care about these properties and realize the importance of saving our history. So with that, I will give a call to anybody who lives in a historic house or has friends or neighbors with a historic house, and you'd be interested in talking with the commission about designation. We would love to hear from you.
Thank you both. Does anybody have any questions of Rebecca or Nicole? And if you're trying to talk, you might be muted, just to FYI. All right. Well, I forgot to introduce myself when we first got on the call. So my name is Cinda Griswold, and I'm president of our Lakewood Historical Society. And we appreciate you joining us this evening. And if you have any further questions that you would like to send to Rebecca and Nicole afterwards, I tend to think of a lot after I get off of a call. So feel free to go ahead and respond back to our VP of Communication, Jay's email when it came out under the Lakewood Historical Society news email. And we'll be sure to forward those on and keep everybody in the loop. And thank you so much for joining us for our first program in the evening. And if this is something you've enjoyed, please let me know. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.